Chapter 30 to 31. Jane POV. As we departed from the hotel, our next destination was to pick up the kids from school. Today, I stumbled upon an old photo of Alpha Brian from his teenage years on the internet, hoping it would satiate Valentin's relentless curiosity and stem the tide of questions he had about his father. However, I was still grappling with how much to reveal about his father's relationship with me, whether to disclose that he was my mate or not. I knew that revealing this detail would only lead to more probing questions from Valentin, and I was unsure how to navigate that conversation. I was desperately seeking a way to sidestep this issue altogether. As we neared our home, the sound of sirens pierced the air, causing Zelda to mutter curses under her breath as she glanced at the rearview mirror, signaling trouble ahead. "Geez," I muttered, feeling a knot of apprehension tighten in my stomach. "I wonder why they're pulling us over." "You're not doing anything wrong," I remarked to Zelda. Zelda's brows furrowed in concern as she maneuvered the car to the side of the road. She hastily searched through the clutter in the glove box, her hands trembling as she retrieved the necessary documents, insurance and registration papers, almost spilling them onto the floor in her nervousness. As the officer approached the vehicle and knocked on the window, Zelda rolled it down, her expression frozen in a mix of anxiety and confusion. "Afternoon, ladies," the officer greeted, his tone casual but authoritative. Zelda remained silent, her gaze fixed on the officer, her hands still trembling. "Afternoon, officer," I responded, trying to fill the awkward silence left by Zelda's shock. I offered a small wave, hoping to diffuse the tension, but the uncertainty in the air was palpable. "License and registration," the officer requested, extending his hand expectantly towards Zelda, who nervously passed over the documents she had retrieved. I shot her a quizzical look, raising an eyebrow at her uncharacteristic anxiety. "Here, sir," Zelda stuttered, her voice betraying her unease as she handed over the papers. The officer briefly scanned the documents before returning them to Zelda. "I'm afraid I have to book you for." The officer trailed off, stepping around the car to inspect it more closely. He crouched down to examine the underside of Zelda's Volkswagen before circling back to my side, scrutinizing the exterior. "Bald tires," he announced matter-of-factly. My eyebrow arched in disbelief before frustration seeped in. It was unmistakably Brian's doing. This officer seemed clueless about the reason for pulling us over, and it was evident he was grasping at any excuse to target us. "They're brand new," Zelda argued desperately, but the officer merely shrugged and began writing her a defect notice. Just as the situation seemed to escalate, Margaret pulled up behind us in her car. "Friend of yours?" the officer inquired, his attention momentarily diverted as Margaret approached. "Is everything all right, officer?" Margaret queried, concern evident in her voice as she stopped beside him. However, the officer remained focused on his task, jotting down notes on his notepad without so much as a glance in Margaret's direction. "Yes, your friend here has bald tires," he replied curtly, his tone brooking no argument. "Bald tires?" Margaret questioned incredulously, inspecting the wheels, none of which showed any signs of being bald. "Yep, I am giving her a defect notice. She shall have 14 days to fix the issue, or I will pull her car from the road," the officer explained sternly. "This is insane," Zelda muttered under her breath, her frustration evident. "Pardon, ma'am," the officer asked with a smug smile playing on his lips. "Nothing, sir," Zelda snapped, her grip tightening on the steering wheel as she stared ahead, tension radiating from her body. A bead of sweat trickled down the back of her neck as she clenched her jaw. The officer chuckled softly before handing her the paper, seemingly amused by the situation. "I'll be seeing you later," the officer stated cryptically before turning to leave. "Hopefully not," Margaret retorted dryly, prompting a laugh from the officer as he made his way back to his car. "Are you all right?" "You totally freaked out when he tapped on your window," I voiced my concern to Zelda, who remained silent, her gaze fixed on the departing officer. Margaret joined us by Zelda's window, observing the scene with a furrowed brow. "Zelda," Margaret prodded when Zelda didn't respond to me. Concern etched into her features as she sought an explanation. "That's Terrence's father," Zelda finally admitted, the revelation causing me to gasp audibly as I turned to watch the man drive away into the traffic. His father is a cop? Does he know about Carol? I asked, my mind racing with the implications. No, of course not, Zelda replied, her voice tinged with anxiety. I thought when he pulled me over. I don't know. I thought maybe he found out about Carol and would demand and take her from me, Zelda confessed, her fear palpable. No one is taking our kids from us, I reassured her firmly, reaching over to rub her back in a gesture of comfort. Zelda nodded, taking a few deep breaths to steady herself. Come on, we should get the kids, I suggested, trying to shift our focus away from the unsettling encounter. Margaret leaned in, giving Zelda's hand a supportive squeeze before returning to her own car, understanding the need for us to regroup and prioritize our family. Margaret left first, and we were nearly at the school when she, too, got pulled over by the same officer. That prick, I growled, frustration bubbling up as I watched Margaret pull over to the curb in front of the school. The scene drew the attention of other parents as the officer stepped out of his car. What did he get you for? I inquired as Margaret caught up with us. We parked a few cars down from her, and Margaret stood on the sidewalk, arms folded tightly across her chest, a look of pure fury etched on her face. Apparently, my headlight is broken because I used them all day, and me turning it on was a fluke, Margaret seethed, her gaze fixed on the officer, who seemed to be enjoying himself a little too much. As the bell sounded, signaling the end of the school day, kids began streaming out of the building, catching the officer's attention momentarily. Sensing the tension, Zelda rushed over, shielding Carol with her body and swiftly ushering her into the car, strapping her in with practiced efficiency. Carol looked up at her mother, confusion evident in her eyes as Zelda hurriedly secured her in the car seat. Meanwhile, the other children emerging from the schoolyard began to murmur amongst themselves, noticing the officer's presence and the firearm at his side. The atmosphere grew tense as rogue parents hurriedly gathered their children, fearing the situation might escalate further. I shook my head in disbelief, reaching out for Valentin and helping him into the car, eager to put some distance between us and the increasingly chaotic scene. Want us to take Tessie? I offered, concern evident in my voice as I glanced at Margaret, who shook her head resolutely. No, go ahead. I need to drop her at Mom's anyway, Margaret called back, strategically positioning herself to block any view of us from behind her car. As we pulled away, I watched in the rearview mirror as Margaret opened the back door and buckled Tessie into her booster seat, ensuring her safety before addressing the situation at hand. Driving off, Zelda let out a fleeting breath of relief, but the tension lingered in the air. We were on the verge of pulling into the hotel's driveway when the blaring sirens and the sight of the cop car speeding up behind us shattered any semblance of calm. For God's sake, not again, Zelda muttered, her frustration palpable, but her attention quickly shifted to Carol in the back of the car. Swear jar, Carol chimed in from the back seat. Carol, duck down in your seat for me, Zelda instructed, her tone urgent yet gentle. Carol furrowed her brows in confusion, but complied, sinking down in her seat as instructed. Meanwhile, Valentin observed the scene with a mix of concern and curiosity, his gaze alternating between the approaching officer and Carol's discreet action. Zelda muttered a curse under her breath as she observed the officer getting out of his car through the rearview mirror. Acting quickly, she mirrored his movements, stepping out of the car to block his view of Carol. As the officer approached our vehicle, I watched with a sinking feeling as he deliberately peered into the trunk and then the rearview mirror, his scrutiny intensifying with each passing moment. Just as he leaned in closer, practically pressing his nose against the window, Carol glanced up, catching his eye. His expression shifted from confusion to anger in an instant. It was as if with one look, he could sense the familial connection, a realization that sent a chill down my spine. That's my son's kid, he snarled, his hands pressing against the glass as he peered inside, his gaze fixated on Carol. Zelda moved to intervene, attempting to block his view, but it was too late. Why do you have her? How? I don't understand. Open this door now, he demanded, his voice booming with authority and rage. I swiftly exited the car, my heart pounding as I watched the tense confrontation unfolding. Zelda was desperately pulling on the officer's arm, trying to impede his progress towards Carol's side of the vehicle. "I will arrest you for kidnapping," he snarled at Zelda, his voice dripping with menace. "Get away from her, you aren't taking her," Zelda retorted, her voice trembling with defiance as she attempted to shove him away from the car. "Just try and stop me. Move," the officer barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. I positioned myself in front of Carol's door, determined to protect her at all costs. But the officer forcefully gripped the handle and shoved me aside, causing me to stumble. Carol, frightened by the sudden chaos, began to cry, tears streaming down her cheeks as I regained my footing, my heart aching for her. I peered through the window just in time to witness Carol climbing out of her seat, seeking refuge closer to Valentin, who instinctively wrapped his arms around her protectively. "Move, lady, I need to double-check something," the officer snapped at Zelda, his tone brusque and impatient. Zelda, however, stood her ground, tossing herself in front of the door, effectively blocking his access. In a moment of desperation and defiance, Zelda shoved the officer, causing me to gasp in shock at the sudden escalation. "Get the hell away from my daughter," Zelda growled in a warning, her eyes transforming into obsidian, her canines and claws protruding as her primal instincts took over. The tension escalated rapidly as the officer growled in frustration at Zelda's defiance. Ignoring his warning, she stood firm, her resolve unyielding. In a desperate attempt to subdue her, the officer reached for Zelda, but she reacted with lightning speed, slashing his arm with her claws. He grunted in pain, but his determination didn't waver. In the chaotic struggle, the officer fumbled for his handcuffs, aiming to restrain Zelda. But in a twist of fate, his gun slipped from its holster, clattering to the ground. Seizing the opportunity, he lunged at Zelda, trying to regain control of the situation. Zelda fought back fiercely, her wild and crazed demeanor shocking everyone present, including me. I moved to intervene, attempting to grab hold of the officer to force him to release her, but Zelda's ferocity was unlike anything I had ever witnessed before. Her protective instincts had completely taken over, driving her to lash out against anyone who threatened her daughter. As the chaos unfolded before me, I felt a sickening sensation gnawing at the pit of my stomach, realizing that my worst fears were materializing right in front of my eyes. The mere thought of someone harming Valentin sent a sharp pang of pain coursing through my heart, intensifying my sense of dread. Just as I was consumed by these thoughts, a searing pain exploded across the side of my face. The officer had backhanded me with force, sending me sprawling to the ground. I tasted blood on my lip as I struggled to collect myself, dazed and disoriented. "I didn't mean that, damn, he will surely kill me," the officer muttered in panic as he grappled with restraining Zelda, his desperation evident. Both Valentin and Carol screamed in terror as they watched the altercation unfold, their cries piercing through the chaos. Through the haze of pain and confusion, I heard the screech of tires as a car skidded to a stop nearby. I turned to see Margaret emerging from her vehicle with a fierce determination etched on her face. Without hesitation, she lunged forward, gripping the officer's shirt and tearing him away from Zelda. The officer stumbled back, taken aback by Margaret's sudden intervention, as I scrambled to my feet, grateful for her timely arrival. "There are kids present, officer. Do you really want to scare your granddaughter?" Margaret snapped, her voice laced with anger and disgust as she confronted the officer. Surprisingly, her words seemed to give him pause, causing him to halt his advance toward her. "So she is?" the officer asked, peering through the back window of the car, his tone tinged with uncertainty. "Please, please," Zelda begged, her voice trembling with desperation as she dropped to her knees, overwhelmed by the unfolding situation. "Answer me," the officer roared at Zelda, his aggression resurfacing as he took a menacing step toward her. However, Margaret wasn't about to let him intimidate Zelda any further. With a low growl, she stepped forward, her claws slipping out in a display of primal defiance, ready to protect her friend and the children at all costs. "Yes, yes," She is Terrence's, Zelda admitted, her voice trembling as she looked at the officer with pleading eyes. The officer hesitated, his gaze shifting between Margaret and Zelda before abruptly pushing past Margaret to approach the car. Despite Zelda's attempts to intervene, the officer forcefully flung open the rear door and leaned in. Zelda's heart clenched in fear as he reached for Carol, but the little girl instinctively recoiled, her senses on high alert. "Come here, sweetheart. Poppy won't hurt you," the officer coaxed gently, his tone softening as he extended his hands toward Carol. With uncertainty flickering in her eyes, Carol glanced back at her mother, who looked utterly defeated, her shoulders slumped, tears streaming down her face, her once immaculate mascara now smudged. "I swear, if you try to take her, I will do everything in my power to stop you. I'll spend every cent we have to fight you for custody if you try to take her from Zelda," I threatened, my voice laced with determination and fury. The officer regarded me with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty as he began to pull Carol from the car. I couldn't stand idly by as he forcibly removed her. Gripping his arm tightly, I leaned in close, my voice low and menacing. "You take her, and I will ring my mate." "I will ring the blood alpha," I growled, the mention of the alpha's name carrying weight. The officer hesitated, glancing at me with newfound apprehension. You won't tell him." "I didn't mean to make you," he stammered, his gaze flickering to my split lip, a visible sign of the chaos he had caused. Despite his attempt to backtrack, I held his gaze firmly, refusing to back down. "That depends." "Give her daughter back," I asserted firmly, my eyes locked onto the officer's. Zelda scrambled to her feet, reaching out for Carol, but the officer ignored her, turning his back on her and seating Carol on the hood of her car. "Does Terrence know about her?" he inquired, his gaze piercing as he directed the question at Zelda. "Yes, he knows," Zelda replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. The officer growled under his breath, but then his attention softened as he turned back to Carol, gently brushing her hair away from her face. "What's your name, princess?" he asked her, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Carol," she whispered shyly, wiping her eyes before stealing a glance at her mother. Sensing her distress, Carol reached out for Zelda, her silent plea not lost on anyone present, least of all the officer. "He never told us." "He and his mate are having trouble conceiving," the officer divulged, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. "That is not my issue or Carol's. Anna doesn't need to know about her," Zelda responded firmly, her tone unwavering. The officer nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at Carol. "Can I bring my wife Oriana to meet her?" he asked, his request laced with a mix of hope and longing. "Are you going to tell Anna that Terrence has a daughter?" Zelda countered, her expression guarded. "No, but I will be saying something to my son." "Does he help with her?" he asked. "He pays child support," Zelda stated matter-of-factly as she settled Carol back into the car. She secured her in the seat, and I couldn't help but notice the officer's gaze flicker briefly to Valentin. "He's mine," I asserted firmly when I caught the officer's curious gaze lingering on Valentin. "Does Brian know?" the officer suddenly asked, catching me off guard. Valentin turned to me, his expression filled with curiosity. "No, he doesn't," I replied, my voice tinged with unease. "He has his eyes, the resemblance is uncanny," the officer remarked, his observation striking a chord within me. Unable to meet his gaze, I averted my eyes, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions wash over me. "I will let your wife meet Carol, but only if you don't say anything to Alpha Brian about Valentin. Let Jane tell him when she is ready," Zelda interjected quickly, her words firm and decisive. The officer paused, considering her proposal, before glancing back at Carol and waving to her. "You will tell him?" "I know his father has been putting pressure on him to marry and give him an heir, even lined up an arranged marriage with Alpha Robert's daughter Amanda," the officer explained with a shake of his head. "What?" I exclaimed, trying to mask my surprise. The officer shrugged nonchalantly, leaving me stunned by the unexpected revelation. "The prevailing rumor in the city revolves around Brian. He denied it, but there's a looming threat from his father." If Brian doesn't demonstrate he has an heir soon, his father will stir up trouble. It's advisable to inform him before his father uncovers the existence of your son. While I won't separate Carol from her mother, Kevin will surely take your son if he learns about him, particularly if he discovers your rogue status before Brian officially recognizes you. Reputation holds immense importance to Kevin, the officer stated solemnly, his words heavy with implication. I knew all too well the consequences of defying Alpha Kevin's expectations, having witnessed firsthand the devastation he wrought upon his own mate, merely because she was an Omega. He isn't Brian's, I interjected quickly, hoping to deflect any further speculation. While it was evident the officer knew I was Brian's mate, I could still deny Valentin's paternity. The officer snorted and chuckled incredulously, shaking his head in disbelief. His reaction confirmed my fears. He saw through my feeble attempt at deception. The telltale signs are in his eyes, that unmistakable alpha aura already emanating from him. I can sense it, and I'm sure you can too. He's undoubtedly shaping up to be an alpha. There's no need to deceive me. Alpha Brian informed me that you were his mate. However, he never mentioned a son. The boy's resemblance and aura will reveal the truth to anyone observant enough, Jane. I strongly advise you to inform Brian soon. I wouldn't want you to risk losing your son, the officer stated, his tone somber as he closed the rear door. I could feel Valentin's intense gaze burning with unspoken questions as he listened intently. You have a week's grace, but after that, I'll have no option but to inform him. I'm sorry, but it's necessary. Additionally, I'll have to issue you another ticket. Brian will become suspicious if he doesn't see multiple tickets. He instructed me to hassle you and your acquaintances, but rest assured, I won't file them officially. However, I require them for appearances, unless you intervene and prevent me from seeing my granddaughter. My wife will be thrilled, he added, his demeanor shifting to one of genuine excitement as he beamed at Carol, who waved back at him innocently. You can see her, but Anna must not know, Zelda asserts. Never been fond of her, she's quite snooty. Can I bring my wife by over the weekend? You ladies work at Hotel Kage in Parkview? He queries. We actually own it, I inform him, and his mouth drops open in disbelief. But you're rogues, he stammers. Being rogues doesn't diminish our capabilities, I assert. I suppose not, the officer responds, looking at us all in astonishment. As the officer leaves without taking Carol, a wave of relief washes over me. Yet, a sinking feeling gnaws at the pit of my stomach. Too many people now know my secret, and the inevitability of Brian discovering it looms heavy. In a city fueled by gossip, secrets are rarely kept hidden for long. This is one of those secrets destined to surface. The officer reholsters his gun and glances at me. You won't tell your mate about this? He gestures to his lips. It'll remain between us as long as you keep your promise and refrain from attempting to take Carol. Everyone understands the consequences of crossing the blood alpha. I suspect he wouldn't take kindly to anyone harming his mate. I warn him sternly. He nods, casting a glance at the car. I'll see you on the weekend, Zelda, he says, acknowledging Zelda with a nod before she climbs back into her car.